They stood her on the courthouse steps like unwanted furniture. No chains, no ropes, just words sharp enough to cut deeper than either. Barren, her uncle announced to anyone willing to listen. Married 5 years, no child, husband dead, she's useless to us. She kept her eyes on the dust at her feet, not because she believed them, but because she'd learned what happened when you looked too proud while being discarded. Men passed by, some stared, some laughed, some measured her the way people measure livestock, quietly, efficiently, without shame. That was when the widowed rancher stopped. He hadn't planned to come into town that day. The road had simply taken him there, the way grief often does when it doesn't know where else to go. His coat was worn, his face older than his years. The kind of man people didn't bother trying to impress. He listened. Didn't interrupt, didn't argue. Then he spoke. "How much?" he asked. Her family turned, surprised. Her uncle smiled like he'd just won something. "You want her, she won't give you sons." The rancher stepped closer, close enough that the smile faltered. "I don't need children," he said calmly. "I need her." The words landed wrong in the crowd. Not dramatic, not boastful, certain. She looked up for the first time. He met her gaze, not to inspect, not to own, but to ask without words a question no one had ever bothered to ask her before. "Do you want this?" She swallowed, then nodded once. That was enough. They left town before sunset. No ceremony, no witnesses worth remembering, just a wagon, a long road, and silence that didn't feel dangerous. At the ranch, he showed her the house and then stopped at the doorway. "You decide what rooms you want," he said, "and when." He slept in the barn the first week. Not because she asked, because he believed space was a kind of respect. She learned the rhythms of the land slowly, the way mornings began before the sun, the way grief lingered in small places, an extra cup left out, a chair never moved. His wife had died in childbirth years ago. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. One evening she found him sitting on the porch, staring at nothing. "They said I was broken," she said quietly. He nodded. "People say that when something doesn't give them what they want." She sat beside him, not close, not far. "What if they were right?" she asked. He turned to her then, eyes steady. "Then I'd still choose you." Spring came. And with it, something unexpected. Not a child. Peace. She laughed more, he slept better. The house filled with sound again, not crying, not chaos, but life. Shared meals, quiet talks, music hummed under breath while working. When neighbors whispered, he didn't correct them. When the town gossiped, she didn't hide. Years later, a doctor came through and told her what no one had bothered to check before. "You were never barren," he said, "just sick, it healed." She told the rancher that night. He listened, smiled gently. "That's good news," he said, "but it doesn't change anything." "What if I want children now?" she asked softly. He reached for her hand, the same way he always did, like it was a choice, not a right. "Then we'll welcome them," he said, "and if not, we've already built a family." When their first child came, the town acted surprised. When the second came, the apologies followed. She accepted none of them, because the truth had been there all along. She was never barren. She was waiting for a place where her worth wasn't measured by what she could produce, but by who she was when someone finally chose her without conditions. The years after their first child arrived unfolded gently, without the sharp edges that had once defined her life. Motherhood didn't consume her the way people expected. It joined her, like another voice in a room that was already full. She worked the land with a baby tied to her back, sang to the fields the same songs she sang at night, and taught her children the difference between labor and worth before they were old enough to understand the words. The widowed rancher watched it all with quiet awe. He never introduced her as his wife with pride meant to prove something. He simply said her name, That was enough. When the children were small, the family who had once sold her came to the gate. Her uncle stood thinner now, humility poorly stitched onto his posture. "We heard," he said, "about the children, thought maybe things could be mended." She didn't answer right away. The rancher waited, hands resting calmly on the fence rail. He had learned when to speak, and when silence was the stronger protection. "They can visit," she said finally, "but they don't decide anything here." They nodded quickly, grateful for crumbs of mercy they hadn't earned. The visits were brief, awkward, controlled. She never let her children hear the word Barren. Years passed, the ranch grew. The children did too, strong, curious, unafraid of quiet. When storms came, they learned to read the sky. When hardship came, they learned to sit with it instead of running. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the children chased fireflies in the yard, she turned to the rancher. "If I had known then what I know now," she said, "I might have walked away from town sooner." He shook his head gently. "If you had, you wouldn't be here." She smiled. "I suppose that's true." Later, when the children were grown and the house grew quiet again, they sat together on the porch much like they had years before. "You were enough," he said suddenly. She looked at him, surprised. "You always were," he added, "before the children, after them, with or without anything else." She rested her head against his shoulder, the same place she'd found safety so many years ago. And when people told the story later, they usually told it wrong. They said a barren woman found a man who gave her children. But the truth was simpler and braver. A woman who had been discarded found a man who chose her without conditions. And because of that choice, everything else was allowed to grow. Old age arrived the way dusk does, slow enough that you don't notice it until the light has already changed. The rancher's hair silvered first. His hands stiffened on cold mornings. She learned to saddle his horse when his fingers wouldn't quite cooperate, and he learned to sit without guilt while she finished chores he once did alone. Their children came back often, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with trouble, always with respect. The ranch remained the place where arguments softened and decisions were made after long walks. One autumn, the first frost settling early, the rancher fell ill. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic. Just a quiet weakening, like a fire running out of wood. She stayed by his side, reading aloud at night, old letters, half-forgotten books, even grocery lists from years past. He listened with a smile, eyes closed, content with the sound of her voice. "You saved me," he said once. She shook her head. "You stood still long enough for me to find myself." He laughed softly at that. When the end came, it did not rush him. He passed in his sleep, the window cracked open, the smell of earth and cold air drifting in. She did not scream. She held his hand until it cooled, then kissed his forehead the way she had 1,000 mornings before. The town came, some with flowers, some with regret, all with quiet reverence. They buried him on the rise, overlooking the land he'd never tried to own alone. Afterward, she returned to the house and opened the windows wide. Grief moved in like weather, sometimes heavy, sometimes light, always changing. She stayed, because this place had never been his alone. Years later, when she was old herself, a young woman came to the ranch, eyes tired, voice small. "They say I'm broken," the girl whispered. She smiled gently, the same smile that had carried her through everything. "They said that about me too," she replied. "Come sit." And so the story continued, not as a legend, not as a miracle, but as a line of women and men who learned the same truth, again and again. Worth is not something you produce. It is something you carry. And when one person chooses to see it, a lifetime can grow from that single, quiet decision. The woman lived long enough to see the world change around the ranch. Roads widened. Wagons gave way to engines that hummed instead of rattled. Fences straightened where once there had been only open land and trust. Some changes made her smile. Others made her hold the past a little closer. But the ranch stayed. Not frozen in time, alive. She walked slower now, leaning on a cane carved by one of her sons. Her hands shook when she poured tea, but they were steady when it came to listening. People still found their way to her porch, drawn by something they couldn't name. A girl once arrived at dusk, bruised in places long hidden. "They told me I'm nothing without a husband," the girl said, eyes fixed on the floor. The old woman reached out, warm fingers closing gently around cold ones. "Sit," she said. "Let me tell you about a man who didn't need children and a woman who didn't need permission." The girl listened. So did the land. When winter came harder than expected, the old woman knew her time was close. She wasn't afraid. She had outlived shame, grief, and every lie ever spoken over her name. One quiet morning, she asked to be taken to the hill. They wrapped her in a blanket and carried her slowly, carefully, up to the place where the rancher lay. Snow dusted the grass like memory made visible. She looked out over the fields one last time. "I was chosen," she whispered. "That was enough." Her breathing slowed. The world held still. They buried her beside him, two simple markers side by side. No grand words carved in stone. Just names. And if you pass that hill today, you'll see wildflowers growing thick where the soil is richest. People sometimes ask why. The answer is simple. The land remembers who was loved without conditions. And it keeps giving back. Years turned into decades. The ranch became legend, not for gold, not for battles won, not even for the storms survived, but for the choices made quietly, day after day, by two people who refused to let the world define their worth. The children grew, built homes of their own, and carried the lessons learned on that wide-open land into every corner of their lives. They taught their own children how to listen before judging, how to act before blaming, and how to stand for someone even when the world had already condemned them. Travelers still came, seeking shelter and counsel, and everyone left changed. Some found courage, some found peace, but all found the quiet truth. A life shaped by choice is stronger than any life shaped by fear. Even when the ranch changed hands, even when the fields grew wild again and barns needed repairs, the story of the deaf girl, the widowed rancher, and the family they built endured. It lived in the wind through the tall grass, in the laughter echoing across the hills, in the firelight that once carried whispered promises and quiet understanding. And if you walk that land at dawn, when the mist rises from the valleys and the world is just waking, you can still feel it, the power of being seen, chosen, and valued for exactly who you are. Because in the end, worth isn't given, it's recognized. And when it is, it can change not just a life, but generations. The ranch stood, the story lived, and the lesson remained. Love and respect chosen freely are stronger than any brand, any lie, or any fear.